Okay, welcome to the second team-based learning packet for Bio 140. We are going to be tackling the autonomic nervous system. All right, so this is just looking at the hierarchy of the nervous system, and we've spent some time in all the different areas of the nervous system except for this autonomic nervous system. So just to refresh your memory, we have central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Underneath the peripheral nervous system, we have sensory, which we've been spending a lot of time with already this semester, with all the special senses. And then underneath the motor, the efferent division, we have somatic, which we spent a lot of time with last semester, mainly dealing with skeletal muscle. And then the autonomic nervous system, which includes sympathetic and parasympathetic, and that's what we're going to be dealing with today. Okay, so underneath the umbrella of the autonomic nervous system, we want to look at some differences between somatic and autonomic. Okay, so one of the main differences here is this idea that we have in the somatic nervous system, we have so we have, on the somatic side, we have a single neuron going all the way from the central nervous system out to the organ that it wants to affect. Okay, in the autonomic, we have a two-neuron chain. So we have a lightly myelinated, what's called preganglionic neuron, and then we have a non-myelinated postganglionic neuron. So there's a ganglion in the middle, which is the synapse and collection of cell bodies, and you're always going to have that situation in both parasympathetic and sympathetic. Okay, another major difference is this myelination. Okay, very heavily myelinated, very fast traveling of the signals with the somatic, and lightly myelinated preganglionic and not myelinated postganglionic in the autonomic. So it's going to be slower signals. And you can see the neurotransmitters are different. Okay, so in the somatic nervous system, it's always acetylcholine at the effector site, the target tissue. With the sympathetic nervous system, we have mainly norepinephrine at the effector, at the target tissue. But between those two neurons, that ganglionic synapse, we have acetylcholine. And then we have this special situation where the adrenal medulla is actually releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood, and that kind of acts as the postganglionic neuron in the blood does. But then on the parasympathetic side, it's similar to the somatic, where we always have acetylcholine, both in the synapse here as well as in the at the target tissue. Okay, so another main difference is the tissues that these affect. Somatic is skeletal muscle, and autonomic is smooth muscle and glands. And then finally, the last difference here is this idea that the somatic nervous system is always going to have stimulatory effects, whereas the autonomic can be stimulatory or inhibitory depending on the organ that it's reaching and the neurotransmitter released. Okay, so within the autonomic nervous system, we have two main categories of receptor types. So these are receptors that the neurotransmitters are binding to. Okay, so we have the cholinergic receptors, which are named this because they respond to the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Okay, and then underneath those cholinergic receptors, there's two different types, the nicotinic and the muscarinic receptors. And these are named by chemicals that were found to stimulate these receptors. So nicotinic respond to nicotine. These are found in neuromuscular junctions, as well as the ganglions of the autonomic nervous system, so that synapse between the two nerves. And then we have muscarinic receptors, which these are stimulated by a poison found in mushrooms called muscarine. And these are found on targets of the autonomic nervous system, like cardiac muscle and smooth muscle and glands. Okay, and then we have the adrenergic receptors, and adrenergic receptors are named that because they respond to norepinephrine and epinephrine. And remember that epinephrine's kind of nickname is adrenaline, and that's why adrenergic. That's why we have that cholinergic choline with acetylcholine. That's why they're named that. Okay, so these are found on the targets of the sympathetic nervous system. And these have all kinds of subclassifications. There's beta 1, 2, 3 and alpha 1, 2. You don't need to know the differences of those different ones, but you will need to remember that the beta and the alpha are part of the adrenergic receptors. Okay, so in general, the control of the autonomic nervous system is obviously done by the central nervous system, and the main control center of the autonomic nervous system is the hypothalamus. Okay, and this is where we've talked about before, heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, body water, endocrine, all of this is kind of controlled here. And so the hypothalamus integrates input from other regions of the brain. Okay, so cerebral cortex is going to send information down, mainly the frontal lobe. The limbic system is going to send emotional input in, and these signals are going to be processed here in the hypothalamus, and then the hypothalamus is going to integrate all of these signals and then send out the proper responses via that autonomic nervous system. And that's where the brainstem comes into play. This receives input from the hypothalamus, causes some reflexive actions, and those are going to be sent out via the brainstem or via the spinal cord. Those are all kind of reflexive actions there. Okay, so the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system, it's good to look at some of the differences here and some of the similarities between parasympathetic and sympathetic. Okay, so first of all, we have this interesting setup which has a ganglion. Okay, so a ganglion is a cluster of synapses between cell bodies and axons. Okay, and you have this always in the autonomic nervous system. You have a preganglionic neuron interacting with a postganglionic neuron somewhere in the middle, and that's the ganglion. Okay, so then the parasympathetic literally means alongside. Okay, so it's alongside the sympathetic. Sympathetic's in the middle, and then you'll find parasympathetic on either side of it. Okay, so parasympathetic nerves are coming from the brainstem and the sacral nerve, so at the very top or at the very bottom of the central nervous system. Whereas with the sympathetic nervous system, they're coming from the middle, so all thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord is where the sympathetic nerves come out. Okay, and then both the sympathetic and parasympathetic both have this two neuron setup that we've talked about already. Okay, so this is just looking at the parasympathetic and sympathetic, and this picture shows nicely what I was just mentioning, where you have the parasympathetic neurons up here in the brainstem, all these purple ones, and then also parasympathetic neurons down here in the sacral region. Okay, so on both sides of the sympathetic, and so these green ones are all the sympathetic nerves. Okay, they're all in the middle. All right, and so that's just the locations in the CNS. One major difference between parasympathetic and sympathetic is the length of the neurons. Okay, so on the parasympathetic side, you have very long preganglionic neurons. Those are the ones coming from the central nervous system, and very short postganglionic. Okay, and that's going to lead to very specific effects, very not diffuse effects, but having very specific effects on certain targets. Whereas in the sympathetic, you have very short preganglionic neurons and these very long branched postganglionic neurons. And so the effect of this first level of the sympathetic nervous system, you can see interacts with many neurons here, and it's going to have multiple effects. So the effects are more diffuse and not quite as specific on the sympathetic side. And parasympathetic side, the effects are very specific and very controlled, and that's why, and that's partially due to the fact that we have this long preganglionic and short postganglionic on the parasympathetic side, and opposite on the sympathetic. Okay, so we can go through this kind of recap here. The spinal cord CNS region on the CNS side is cranial and sacral. Okay, parasympathetic side is thoracic and lumbar. Okay, so the general effects of these, sympathetic is obviously fight or flight, dealing with stress, whereas parasympathetic is general housekeeping functions. Okay, the length of the effect, sympathetic is going to be much longer lasting because we have this hormonal influence too with the adrenal medulla releasing hormones into the blood. Those have a lot longer effects. On the parasympathetic side, it's short-lived because it's only that neuron interacting, and then the neurotransmitter is pulled back up and the effect is gone. Specificity of effects, we had just mentioned that previously, very diffuse effects because of the hormones, because of the branching of neurons in the sympathetic side, and very specific effects in the parasympathetic. And so then on the sympathetic side, as I mentioned, long postganglionic neuron and short postganglionic neuron in the parasympathetic. Okay, so the pathways, I'm going to need to be able to know the pathway for the parasympathetic versus the pathway for the sympathetic. Okay, so again, parasympathetic, you have this long preganglionic neuron, reaches almost all the way to the target, and then it releases acetylcholine into the ganglionic synapse. Okay, so there it's going to bind to a nicotinic receptor, which is a type of cholinergic receptor, and that's on the postganglionic neuron. So that's going to stimulate that postganglionic neuron to have an action potential. And then there's this little short postganglionic neuron that goes right to the target, and that's going to release acetylcholine into the neuromuscular junction if it's smooth muscle, or into the gland junction if it's a gland. And this stimulates a muscarinic receptor on the target tissue. So you need to know that pathway. Okay, so we'll look at some specific effects of the parasympathetic system now, and this is looking at the ones coming from higher, from the cranial nerves. Okay, so most of these we've already done. Okay, so the cranial nerve 3, oculomotor, causes contraction of the iris, and this is going to constrict the pupil for protection or near vision. This contracts the ciliary body to bulge the lens for near vision, and one clinical application of this is a drug called atropine. This drug blocks muscarinic cholinergic receptors in the iris, and so if we're blocking parasympathetic activity, that's going to lead to pupil dilation, and this allows us to have a nice eye exam. So optometrists use this drug frequently. Okay, so cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, is going to stimulate these 3 glands. Okay, stimulates the lacrimal gland in the eyes to release tears, stimulates the nasal glands in the nose for mucus, and stimulates salivary glands in the mouth to aid digestion. All of those are kind of housekeeping functions. Okay, and then we have cranial nerve 9, stimulates the salivary glands to release saliva. It's very similar to cranial nerve 7's job. There's some different glands are innervated by that nerve. Okay, also the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, is a major parasympathetic nerve. It's known as the wanderer because it distributes its fibers all over the body. So some of the specific effects that we'll talk about are the effects on the heart. Okay, so parasympathetic activity of the heart leads to decreased heart rate and decreased strength of contractions. The bronchioles are going to be stimulated by this nerve as well, and going to lead to constriction of the bronchioles via smooth muscle contraction. And then the digestive organs, all of those listed here. Vagus nerve stimulates digestion and movement of food, as well as stimulating secretion of digestive enzymes into the GI tract. And then with the kidneys, this is going to stimulate increased urine production. So these are all kind of housekeeping functions of the body. Okay, and then so this is for you guys to do and to recap what we just talked about. So knowing the effects of the cranial nerve, of the parasympathetic nerves on the eye, effects of these parasympathetic nerves on glands, effects on the heart, bronchioles, digestive organ, and kidneys. So this, you guys can recap this on your own. This is what you'll be expected to know. Okay, so then the other side of the parasympathetic nervous system, the inferior side, are the sacral nerves. And so it's the distal half. This innervates the distal half of the large intestine. Okay, so the main job here is to continue to move waste through, so causing smooth muscle contraction, causing relaxation of the different sphincters along the way through the GI tract to allow food to move and to allow defecation to happen. Okay, so then we've got the also ureters in the bladder. So again, relaxing sphincters between kidneys and ureter to allow the urine to pass through from the urine to the bladder, and then as well as contracting the bladder and relaxing the sphincter that allows urine to pass through. Okay, and then the reproductive function of this is to allow for erection to occur in the penis and the clitoris. Okay, and again, you guys can recap this on your own. Okay, so let's move on to the specific effects of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so this clicker question up here is one you guys can look at and answer on your own. The sympathetic nervous system has very diffuse effects, and this is due to lots of branching in the neurons, okay, after that ganglia, and then shorter preganglionic neurons and very long postganglionic neurons. They have a lot of opportunity to spread out and affect different parts of the body that are on different levels from where they come out of the spinal cord. Also, we have these hormones that are released into the blood. Those have much longer lasting effects and much more diffuse effects. So again, you'll need to know this pathway, which is different than the parasympathetic nervous system. Pathway shows a short preganglionic neuron, and then each preganglionic synapse with many postganglionic neurons. Okay, so it's not just one. Parasympathetic is one. In this case, it's many preganglionic neurons. So these are all going to branch out. Within this preganglionic synapse, the first neuron, the preganglionic neuron, is going to release acetylcholine, and that targets a nicotinic receptor on these postganglionic neurons. Okay, and then on the postganglionic neurons, these are very long, and they can travel up or down all over the body. And then there's three different options that we have here for how they're going to have their effects on the target tissue. So most of them, in the large majority, release norepinephrine into an adrenergic receptor. Okay, there's a few that release acetylcholine into muscarinic receptors, similar to the parasympathetic system. But then the other option is the adrenal medulla, kind of substituting for that postganglionic neuron, releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood, and then we have those diffuse effects. So, look at these specific effects of the sympathetic nervous system again. So, the effects that the sympathetic nervous system has on the head and the thorax. So one, the ciliary muscle causes we get relaxation of the ciliary muscle by sympathetic activity, causing the lens to flatten out. With the iris, sympathetic activity causes relaxation, which leads to the pupil getting larger. Then these glands, nasal gland, salivary gland, we reduce mucus production. Okay, in the nasal gland and the salivary glands, we stimulate thick, viscous saliva. Okay, and that's going to have the effect of not losing any more water. Okay, by having thick saliva, we don't lose water through our saliva. And nasal gland, reducing mucus production. Okay, so again, saving water, holding on to water. Okay, with the heart, we are going to increase heart rate and contractility or strength of the heartbeat with sympathetic activity. And then the bronchioles is just the opposite. The parasympathetic, bronchial sympathetic activity causes dilation of the bronchioles. Okay, so we have some clinical applications here, which are very important. I definitely want you to understand and know these clinical applications for the TBL day. So, two very common cold drugs, phenylephrine and pseudoephedrine. Both of these act on the alpha-1 adrenergic adrenergic receptors, and they're agonists, so that means they activate these receptors. Okay, so this leads to constricting the blood vessels in the nose and causing vasoconstriction, and that leads to reduced mucus production. Okay, so we're activating this system. We are activating the nasal glands by sympathetic activity, as well as constricting the blood vessels to this area, and this leads to less mucus production. So when you take Tylenol sinus or something like that, phenylephrine, most of the cold drugs, Dayquil, Tylenol sinus, those types of things, they have phenylephrine or Sudafed in them, and that's how they work. They reduce mucus production. Number two here, we have these drugs called beta blockers, which are very common cardiac drugs and blood pressure drugs, and some common names are propranolol and metoprolol, and these are for blood pressure. What they do is they block the beta adrenergic receptors, and that leads to no sympathetic activity being allowed on blood vessels, and sympathetic activity would constrict. So for blocking that, we're vasodilating, and that leads to lower blood pressure. Albuterol is a very common asthma medication. These work by being an agonist to beta-2 adrenergic receptors, meaning that this activates the sympathetic nervous system response in the bronchioles of the lungs, and so we get dilation of the bronchioles in the lungs. And this is obviously what we want if someone's having an asthma attack, right? So that's that. Definitely need to know those applications. Okay, so again, this is for you guys to recap what we just talked about. Okay, and this is really looking at T1 through T6. This is considered the first part of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, and then the lower body effects of the sympathetic nervous system are shown here. So we have some different targets and actions. Okay, so on the adrenal gland, again, this is part of the sympathetic nervous system, the adrenal medulla. So this is going to release epi and norepinephrine, norepinephrine, and this has whole body effects. Okay, sympathetic nervous system causes the liver to release glucose, stores into the blood. If we're under stress, we want to have more glucose available for use. The pancreas is going to have its release of insulin be inhibited by the sympathetic nervous system. And insulin would lower blood glucose levels. We don't want that under stress. We want to have high blood glucose levels, so we want to inhibit the release of insulin. Large intestine is going to be inhibited to contract, and it's going to stimulate the anal sphincter to contract. Okay, so both sympathetic activities leads to stopping defecation, stopping digestion of food. In the bladder, it's pretty much the same thing. We can this sympathetic activity causes the bladder to constrict, the sphincter to contract, and then stop the bladder from contracting to smooth muscle. So that stops urination. Okay, and then reproductive-wise, sympathetic activity is what leads to orgasm in both males and females, and ejaculation in the male. Okay, again, you can recap this information here, and that's about it.